Member for Coquitlam-Mallardville.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I'm pleased to speak today to the Discriminatory Provisions Historical Wrongs Repeal Act. And I guess I'm proud to stand here in this House and speak to why I think this is a really good piece of legislation. But I also stand here with a little bit of sadness, Honourable Speaker, because we're speaking to this on the heels of a bomb threat at the Vancouver Jewish Community Centre. And we are speaking to this shortly after the murder of Muslim men at a mosque in Quebec. And so I think it's important that we sort of recognize and acknowledge the work that we have to do as British Columbians and as Canadians, that while we look back at laws that were made when BC joined Confederation and we read through some of these laws and related House activities and what's gone on, we can't just sort of sit back on our heels and say, yes, that was 100 years ago, Honourable Speaker, that we look and we're sort of horrified and almost chuckle because it's like so ridiculous now. But there are still awful things that happen to groups of people just because they look different or they sound different or they eat different or they dress different. And so we always must remain vigilant. I'm particularly pleased, Honourable Speaker, to address this piece of legislation because I know that it was really a collaborative effort, that the minister and her team had to go back and by hand and go through very old laws, and that took a lot of work. I understand that it was over 200 hours, and that's tedious work and musty books. But I also know that some of my colleagues on this side of the House also put in considerable effort to raise the issue of having these racist laws on our books. And so the previous member from Mount Pleasant, Jenny Kwan, along with the member from Surrey Wally and Vancouver Kingsway back in 2014, they prepared and developed a very thorough list of discriminatory legislative measures and actions. They reviewed statutes, motions, and reports, and they essentially hunted down legislation that historical legislators brought into effect here in this very chamber. And so I thought it would be really helpful to sort of go back and just take a look at some of those motions and some of those laws, because I think it provides us with a context. And we often say, if these walls could speak, right? If these walls could speak, what have they heard? And we have it here. We have it on record, and I think it's important to understand the context. Not because it makes it okay, but it helps us to understand. And I think one of the reasons why we go back and we take a look is it helps us reflect on what we're doing and saying today. If this is what they were saying 100 years ago about the Chinese, about the Japanese, about South Asian immigrants, what are we saying now about Syrian immigrants? What are we saying now about people that come from faraway places that look different, act different, speak different than the rest of us? And it holds us to account. So I think it's always important to go back and look at history and appreciate what was going on so that we can then reflect on what we're doing today. And so just going back to 1872, if these walls could speak, it was clearly there were men in this chamber only at the time. And on February 26, 1872, MLA Robson moved to impose a per capita tax of $50 a head per annum upon all Chinese within the province. Now, what's interesting, Honourable Speaker, is that the motion lost. It didn't get support. But the fact that somebody would say that suggests that it wasn't just them. They came from a community. As MLAs, we represent a body of people. So there were people in this province that were saying and informing this MLA that we need to do something to disallow, to not permit the Chinese to come. This happened again a couple of years later, the exact same thing, but again, the motion did not pass. Now, in 1876, there was a discussion at the Committee of the Whole, and it was on immigration. Now, immigration was not a provincial area, but they still had this conversation about it. And I want to read a quote, Honourable Speaker, because I think if we think about what's going on today, because I think this is, even though this is historical, we always have to reflect on today. One of the quotes from that debate in this House was, and this is the quote, the Committee of the Whole was doing this for the purpose of considering the expediency of taking steps towards preventing the country from being flooded with a Mongolian population, ruinous to the best interests of British Columbia, particularly particularly her laboring classes. And then they amended the motion to read, a select committee be appointed to consider and report to this House upon the best means to be adopted to prevent the spread of the Chinese evil. Now, Honourable Speaker, we only need to look to the south of the border. And it breaks my heart. I was reading through this and I kept thinking, oh my goodness, you know, you know, here we are in 2017, and we can hear this rhetoric, we can hear this hatred, we can hear this racism. And I'd love to say that we've come so far, but I have to say, I get discouraged, Honourable Speaker, when I read these words and I read what's going on south of the border, because I don't know that we've actually gotten very far. Again, in 1879, a few years later, there's another motion. It was resolved that a select committee be appointed to report on the best means to, and I quote, deal with our Chinese population and to prevent further immigration of Chinese to the province. The report of the Select Standing Committee on Chinese Immigration was presented in the legislature on March 28, 1879. And it continues, Honourable Speaker, in 1883 in the throne speech, right? It's a throne speech, so the government of the day felt very strongly, and they actually presented to British Columbians what their vision was. And on January 25, 1883, the Lieutenant Governor said, and I quote, the increasing evils arising from the unrestrained immigration of Chinese led me to urge the federal government to promote the necessary legislation for the purpose of restricting Chinese from entering this province and from obtaining employment on Dominion Public Works, and I shall ask you to make further representations on the same subject to the Parliament of Canada. So here in British Columbia, there was a movement afoot to appeal to the federal government to keep the Chinese from coming. They were seen as an evil, as a plague. And I think about today, and I think about the refugee situation that we have today, and I think about the hate that we hear from south from the border. And I know that my colleague from New Westminster has certainly talked about racist posters that have popped up in New Westminster and that we see in Abbotsford about Islamophobia. And certainly we're seeing that in the Jewish community to this day. And so it hurts my heart, Honourable Speaker, when I think about how it's the same rhetoric, it's the same fear, it's the same anxiety, just a different group, Honourable Speaker. And I wonder a little bit about who we are as humans, that we get so stuck in this box, and that we think that we've come a long way. We think that, that's so, early, late 1800s, 2 centuries ago, that those were those attitudes. That was back then. Now, these were the people representing British Columbians. And so it certainly speaks to the number of British Columbians that felt that way, that were afraid of being sort of overtaken, whatever that might look like. And when you look at our landmass, when you think about British Columbia and our landmass, and we think of how small the population was back then, Honourable Speaker, it's like, what were they afraid of? Really, what were they afraid of? And it continued on. There was a debate in 1883 where the BC government were to call on the federal government to pass a law to restrict Chinese immigration to BC and encourage white immigration. White immigration. And really, that's code for European. That is absolutely code for European. And we see that come up a little bit later, Honourable Speaker, when there's lots of conversation around making sure that people spoke English and making sure that they spoke European languages. So even if they didn't speak English, if they spoke French, that was okay. Or if they spoke Spanish, I guess that might have been okay. Or if they spoke German, that was okay. But they couldn't speak Chinese. That was a problem. In 1893, there was a law that I thought was interesting, and it was a law about the home for aged and infirm. And given that I follow the seniors file, this one caught my eye. The Assembly passed the Provincial Home Act on April 12, 1893. It stipulated that Indians or Asiatics could not gain admission. So again, even towards older people, if you were Chinese or South Asian, you couldn't you couldn't participate in a publicly funded, you couldn't live in a publicly funded home for the aged. It was reserved, Honorable Speaker, for white English-speaking people. There's certainly, there were activities that did not allow Chinese to be employed. They were not allowed to work, certainly in public works. They weren't allowed to vote municipally. There's another law in 1897, the Chinese-Japanese alien labor, that the Assembly passed a bill banning the hiring of Chinese and Japanese workers by companies created by private bills. There's a whole list here, Honorable Speaker, of all the different ways in which laws in this province, motions in this province, debates in this House, the walls have heard debates that were horribly discriminatory. And the language that was used was so problematic. There's one in 1900, one on immigration. The Assembly passes a law requiring that any person wanting to immigrate to BC must be able to complete an application in some language of Europe. And I thought this was really interesting, Honorable Speaker, because it didn't say you need to speak the language of the land, which was, on this side of the country, was English. And back east, you could argue it was French. But it didn't even have to do with what language you speak here in Canada. It was the language of Europe. So I suppose Swedish was fine, Finnish was fine, German was fine, Danish was fine. So it was incredibly discriminatory against a particular immigrant group. So it wasn't about being able to do business. It wasn't being able to communicate in this land. It was just not these people. Honorable Speaker, this list goes on and on. Goes on in 1903, the Assembly passed a law forbidding Chinese people or people unable to speak English from being appointed to a position of trust or responsibility in a mine subject to the Act. Voting, in 1907, this one is a different group, but the Assembly amended the Provincial Elections Act to exclude Hindus from voting, and that received royal assent on April 25th, 1907. So they actually specified, it was very, very specific about which groups could and couldn't vote in our communities, couldn't participate. There's one, actually, I almost imagine here in this chamber that there was almost a battle, because as I read through this list, there was an investigation into the act of the Lieutenant Governor regarding Bill 30 of 1907. And that had to do with the position that the Lieutenant Governor took about refusing to assent to the passage, a bill of the last session to regulate immigration into British Columbia. So because they wouldn't give it royal assent, there was a movement afoot that the Governor General be called to investigate the actions of the Lieutenant Governor and dismiss him from office if it is determined that he behaved unconstitutionally. So I can imagine here in this chamber there was this debate. I can almost hear their booming voices and carrying on and waving of fists around, how dare the Lieutenant Governor not act on behalf of the will of British Columbians to stop the immigration of the Chinese, I want to say hordes, I don't know what language they would have used, and then taking it a notch further to saying that we have to appeal to the Governor General because the Lieutenant Governor wouldn't sign off on it. So, Honourable Speaker, these walls have heard it, and we have an obligation to recognize that happened here in this province. And I'm pleased that we've had this opportunity to do this research, to make sure that it goes into the history books, because we need to understand. We need to understand what has gone on in this chamber. It is our obligation, I think, as British Columbians, to have a clear understanding of what's gone on here. And I often wonder, Honourable Speaker, what MLAs 100 years from now, we know that there'll be 87 here after May, maybe there'll be 107 in 100 years, I don't know. And I wonder what they're going to say about the voices that we have all shared here today. And other voices, in terms of other bills and acts and motions and debates. What are they going to say about us in terms of the ways in which we've behaved here in this chamber, the conversations that we've had, the debates that we've had, the stories that we've told. And are they going to be horrified? Are they going to be horrified by some of the debates that we've had here in this House in terms of discriminating against particular groups of people? I know that we've had some interesting debates around sexuality in this and gender in this House. And 100 years from now, what are those legislators going to say about us? So I'm pleased to support this bill. I think it's important that we recognize the wrongs that previous legislators have made. But I think it's important that we don't just, when I saw the bill come up and I took a look, and it's one page, Honourable Speaker. It's one page, and it lists a number of pieces to be repealed, but it has no context, right? It just lists. Pardon me. It just lists sections and it lists numbers and. The Section 4 of an act respecting a subsidy for a way from Victoria to North Saanich, SBC 1886 C16. That's the legalese that is just, what makes the clerks happy, Honourable Speaker, when they see this. It's part of their work. But we have to contextualize it, and that's why I thought it was really important to sort of speak to the kind of place British Columbia was, to speak to the kind of chamber we had, to speak to the debates that went on when this government continually tried to pass legislation and get the government of Canada to limit immigration of the Chinese and to bring in this repulsive head tax to try to discourage immigration. So I want to just remind everybody in this House and all British Columbians about how important it is that we talk about racism and that we don't just pretend like, well, that was then. Because there are so many ways in which we see it played out now. There's so many ways in which our conversation, you can hear it, and it just sort of burbles under the surface. And I'll speak, before I take my seat, I just want to share one story that I remember having a debate with someone who's now on Coquitlam Council. This is when I was first running for council back in 2008. And we were at a concert, of all things. It was a summer concert, and we were sitting on our blankets, and I knew him, and we were just chatting, and he said, so, why do you want to run? And I was telling him about why I wanted to run for council, and we talked about, and I don't know how the subject came up about racism and anti-Semitism in particular, and he says, well, anti-Semitism, it doesn't really exist anymore. Right? Anti-Semitism was pretty rampant back in the day, well into I would argue, into the 60s. Jews couldn't join any of the golf clubs in the Lower Mainland. And so I think it was back in the early 80s, they actually said, well, to hell with that, we'll just get our own golf club. And so the Richmond Golf and Country Club was born, and that became sort of the Jewish golf club. But so it's been alive and well in many different places, as we saw actually recently with the threat at the Jewish Community Center. But when we were debating on this blanket, listening to this music, and he said, we don't have to worry so much because we'll never get to zero. We'll never get to zero. And Honourable Speaker, we always have to fight for zero racism. We always have to fight to make sure, because it creeps up on us, Honourable Speaker. It creeps up on us. And so we cannot be tolerant. We cannot accept it. And I look forward to having a debate once again with this colleague who is on Coquitlam Council now, because we are seeing a rise in anti-Semitism. We are seeing a rise in Islamophobia. I know that we won't see it here in this House. I know that it won't be part of the story that these walls get to take. And I know it won't be 100 years from now where we have to repeal some sections. I have confidence in our ability to do that, Honourable Speaker. But I think if we don't stand up, if all 85 members of this chamber don't stand up and push back when we need to, then it will creep up and it will creep in. And we need to make a point of absolutely always standing up whenever we hear it, Honourable Speaker. And I look forward to hearing more of the debate.